Welcome to this podcast, which describes the Career Readiness Self-Assessment as one of the tools from the Career Readiness Institute. The Institute is a project of the Successful Practices Network, and we've developed this process to help schools think about their instructional programs, particularly in terms of career readiness. The Successful Practices Network is a not-for-profit organization created by Dr. Willard Daggett, and Bill is well known for his work in education leadership, painting a vision about how we prepare students for the future. This Career Readiness Institute is a recent development of activity that builds on a decade of research, working with some of the best schools in the country, cataloging the processes that made a difference in their work. This self-assessment is built around a process that we've outlined in this guide, which is available to members of the Career Readiness Institute. I want to describe in this podcast the features of the self-assessment process and how schools might use this to improve the quality of their instructional programs. In working with schools, we've noticed several issues. Currently, the schools are way too focused on measuring success on a few core academic courses. And enhancing career readiness really requires a change from the current college acceptance equals success culture in schools. Schools often see career readiness and pathways as practices for only some of their students. And finally, schools often adopt practices blindly and rarely evaluate the effectiveness of what they expect to be different as a result. As schools are exploring career readiness practices, we'd encourage schools to take a more systematic and quantitative approach to determining whether those practices make sense for their unique student population. In designing this career readiness self-assessment, we have identified three primary purposes. We want this to be an inexpensive process and structure reflection of the level of career readiness and college readiness in schools. We want to drive more attention toward career aspect of college and career readiness. And we also want to promote a systems process to addressing college and career readiness and adopting any new practices. As we built this process, we went back to the basic systems model. You know the model that has inputs, process, and outputs, or as we might talk about in education, results. And the aspects of what we do in education that fit within each of those boxes, our inputs primarily are students. Now we also have inputs of staff and resources that we work with, but it's about taking students from where they are through a process of teaching and various supports for students that end up with students that are ready. And today we're talking about students that are both college and career ready, or some of us might say life ready. As we determine whether our students are ready, that gives us a measure to go back and examine our process. If students aren't ready, how can we improve the teaching and supports that we've used to better prepare students? And that's the model that we've approached this self-assessment process in. We attempted to answer several questions. What are your learning results? And particularly, are you measuring the right learning results that consider career readiness as part of that success? How well are your practices working? And particularly those practices that focus on career readiness. And finally, are there some cultural barriers in school that may prevent you from trying to weave in some career readiness practices? To address these questions, we've created a process for schools to follow and a set of checklists for schools to use to thoroughly examine aspects of their school. I want to describe a little bit about the checklists, but before I do that, let me share with you a little of our thinking built upon our experience in how we developed these checklists. The Successful Practices Network has worked with the International Center for Leadership and Education with several grants over the last decade. In that process, we re-examined some of the most successful practices in rapidly improving schools. And as a result, we identified and developed a set of checklists that looked at the processes that went on in education and also looked at results. And this was a system that worked very well for schools to say, how well are we doing and what do we need to take action and improve upon? But as we looked at that from a career readiness perspective, we recognized that there wasn't enough focus, particularly on the life career abilities and technical skills in the results. So we wanted to beef that up. We also didn't have enough career-ready practices as part of our processes list from a decade ago. So we made some revisions, and we identified a number of processes that needed to be revised and added to our list, and we also tweaked our results. But in doing this, we realized we had too big and ambitious a process that was going to be awkward for schools to handle. It also ignored the culture piece, which is a huge barrier in trying to shift school culture. So we went to version 2 of our self-assessment, which we now are proposing for schools to work with, and it now includes 3 areas: a focus on results, a focus on part of the instructional processes, particularly that relates to career readiness, and finally a culture piece that looks at some of the characteristics of school culture. Let me walk you through very briefly about the process and some of the individual checklists that you'll see in this self-assessment. As far as checklists, there are 6 separate checklists that relate to successful career readiness practices. We refer to these as practices. There are 4 that relate to college and career readiness, school culture, and we refer to this as culture. And finally, college and career readiness learning results. There are 3 checklists. These last 2 sets of checklists need to focus broadly on college and career readiness. It's too difficult to try and separate out just career readiness. So those really take a comprehensive look at school culture and learning results. Let me briefly take you through the process to get a feel for how a school might conduct this self-assessment. After you've reviewed the documents, you have an opportunity to consult with a Career Readiness Institute coach who will virtually give you some advice on how to adapt the process based to your individual needs. There are several options for completing the process. You can also determine the level of support. You can make this an entirely self-involved assessment with your team, or an opportunity to include experts on site from the Career Readiness Institute. Establishing your team is critical. You want to include administrators who have an overview of the entire instructional program, but also to include teachers with your team as well. So carefully select your team that's going to work on this. There are 3 sets of checklists: the practices, school culture, and results. You may not want to handle all of those in one meeting, but to have separate times for schools' teams to work through with each of those sets of checklists. After the checklists have been completed, there's forms for summarizing those checklists. Then again, talk with your CRI coach about determining the level of support and whether you will work with the results on your own or have an outside facilitator to help with the results. You'll receive back from the Career Readiness Institute a final report which will have a display of all of your data and highlight of some of the strengths and areas that you want to work on with your team. And from there, you can take a proactive approach of determining the next steps and actions that you want to take to enhance career readiness in your school. The last thing I want to do is to just talk a little bit about some of the forms and checklists. In the career ready practices, there are 6 areas we've identified that are particularly important from instruction and support. First, there's instruction around life career abilities, those soft skills that we all emphasize are important but don't pay enough attention to. Another important aspect is personalized pathways and how you're providing options for students to move through the system to achieve high standards. There are some specific instructional practices, such as making instruction relevant and interdisciplinary activities, which are key to career readiness. Counseling and transition is a key support activity. Also, practices in the way that you use data. And finally, external strategic partnerships involving business and the community is important as well. In these checklists, you have an opportunity to look at a number of practices that are derived from research, and you can identify the degree to which these practices are part of your school operation, whether it is absent and you have not addressed that, or if this is an everyday embedded practice that would be rated at the highest level. Here's just an example of the indicators of practices that fall under the specific area of personalized instructional planning. This involves areas such as giving students choices or providing out-of-school experiences for students as well. In the area of culture, there are four culture surveys focusing on leadership, teaching and learning, staff, and students. These surveys rate a little bit different because you're looking at behaviors of the organization and you're rating the degree to which those behaviors occur that range from rarely or never on up to always in existence. And these surveys, which is shown here, the Teaching and Learning Survey, is looking at aspects of key instructional processes and making sure that teaching and learning is the primary focus of conversations among staff. The final area is on learning results. And these checklists come from a process that the Career Readiness Institute has established, where schools take a much more comprehensive look at their learning results. We actually provide a facilitated process to work with districts in examining their learning results. There's a publication that describes this particular process. But we've taken from that work on the learning criteria and identified the following three data categories of academic learning: what do students know, performance learning, what students can do, and life and career, who students are. In these three categories, we've developed three checklists that take districts through looking at their learning results in these three key areas. Here the rating ranges from no data whatsoever on up to where it's exemplary data. Now in these cases you're making a comparison, and that comparison can be your comparison to comparable schools, or it can be comparisons to your individual school goals. The team can make a choice in how they want to pursue that. Here's an example of some of the detail within the performance learning checklist of looking at the kinds of data measures that would relate to student performance. And that includes technical areas, but also academic areas as well. Some of these measures relate to minimum expectations for students, and some of these are measures the degree to which you're taking students into stretch learning to higher levels of achievement. What are some of the ways you can use a self-assessment? It's a way to examine how well your students in schools are honestly performing. It takes a systems approach to college and career readiness rather than just reacting to a state accountability requirement. It's an opportunity to raise support for the need for career and technical education options for students that many schools are considering. It also is a way to develop broader support and a need for career pathways in high school. And it places more attention on the school culture issue. In short, these can be used for anyone desiring to deepen the dialogue on improvement in schools. That's an overview of the self-assessment. You can get more information on the Career Readiness Institute website or talk with the staff at Successful Practices Network to learn more about the Institute.